Hello, everybody. Welcome. Recently, there's something I noticed about the news, and it was bothering me a little bit. So I wanted to create a little video and try to introduce you to something. Basically, since the outbreak occurred in the United States recently, I noticed that there really wasn't much news about Japan and about what's going on in Japan. And I know that a lot of the students and a lot of my friends are living in Japan, and maybe they're curious about what the data shows in terms of the current situation in Japan. And there's some interesting things that I've recently found and discovered online in some of the data. So I wanted to share that with everybody. So let's dive into that data a little bit. So you can see here, this is one of my favorite websites here. It's covidgraph.com. And if you see here, this really gives you a good overview of whatever's happening in the world today, really good overview of the entire global situation that's happening. So you'll see that it tells you the total number of cases, the total number of active cases, recovered cases, and total deaths, and this is around the world from all the government reporting. It also gives you country by country data as we scroll down a little bit. And some of the really interesting stuff here tells you the change in the new cases, which is really important, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. It also shows you the cases per million, which is really important because it tells you the number of cases in relation to the population level. Obviously, places that are more populated, we would expect them to have a few more cases than those who are less populated. Total deaths, and again, you can look at the case per million and look at the number of deaths. And again, new deaths is also a very sad statistic, something we need to take a careful look at. And again, it gives you the death per million, which is another important indicator of data per population rather than just the raw numbers. And finally, this really good data tells us here the lethality on the end. So this lethality measure tells us basically the percentage of people who have been confirmed cases. So these are people who have been tested positive in the total cases, and how many of them have passed away. And again, you can see a wide range of numbers here, which really is puzzling to a lot of different scholars. For example, USA currently is at 1.8%. The world is total about 4.7%. Italy is 10.8%, which is horrific. And then you have Switzerland at 2%, Belgium 4%, 6%. These are around 6%. Now, this is not the fatality rate of the disease. As I mentioned before, there's lots of different kinds of data out there, and we have to be careful about what we're talking about here. We're talking about only people who've been confirmed with the virus and how many of them have passed away. That means that basically they went to the hospital because most of the places are testing in the hospital. And you can see these are the top countries right now with total numbers of cases. We scroll down, we can see some really interesting data they do by country. Now, this data has a timeline in the bottom, and this is across time. And this is not actually the best way to present the data, and I'm going to show you a little bit later that's better way to present the data. But you can look across all of time here, and you can change the dynamics, and you can see this pandemic curve that we would normally see, which increases in slope. The slope value actually increases as it goes up, and that's what we would expect in a kind of epidemic. It's an epidemic curve. So this, actually, we should decrease this. You can see this curve. This is the curve that we don't want to see ever, but this is what we'd expect in an epidemic curve, and then eventually flattens out. Now, I know a lot of people don't believe the numbers in China, that maybe it's up here, maybe it's much bigger, but we can believe that the curve generally looks like this. And then if we look at other countries, we can see them following a similar trajectory. They are in this higher sloping curve. The United States is very clearly mimicking China's curve, but at a higher magnitude, although we don't know if China's numbers are completely accurate. It also has a map, and you can look at the data, download the data, and get the sources, and so other things that are interesting. This is a total confirmed deaths, very similar graph, total change in confirmed cases, and this is very important. What we want to see here is this is basically the slope, right? The change in cases. So if this is increasing, that means there are more and more and more cases every day. And if it's flattening out or decreasing, then we would see that there are less and less cases every day. Going down, doubling and tripling time, this is really interesting data. So we can see the doubling time, how long it takes for the number of cases to actually double. This is an interesting indicator. It's maybe not that useful, but it does tell us how fast the virus is spreading in a particular area. So if we move down the chart, we see we have age and lethality. Now this is done by different countries. So this is Italy on March 26th, and we can see that there are a large number of people who are dying at the higher ages. And Italy has an aging population, so the number of confirmed cases is skewed, and we will see more people in the higher range of age, and we'll also see more deaths of those ages. This is Spain. Again, you'll see it less skewed. This is more of a standard bell curve that we would see in terms of confirmed cases, represents the population more, what we would say a more normal bell curve. But here we see lethality very highly skewed towards the upper aged individuals. This is the percentage of the population of age 65 or more. So what they're saying here is this is basically a vulnerability graph, right? So those with much higher levels of population over 65 has a much higher chance of people ending up in this orange bar here, suggesting that more people will pass away. Japan has the highest rate. And so this is something that Japan really should be taking very seriously, because 28% of the population is over 65, which would mean those are the most likely people to suffer severe illness and possibly pass away from the disease. The highest comorbidity is hypertension, that's high blood pressure. So 73% of the people who died with this disease have hypertension or high blood pressure. This is really important for us to know. And the reason it's important for us to know is because essentially healthy people are not dying. They're getting sick, and people are suffering quite badly from this illness. Some people ending up in the hospital, about 20%, but they aren't dying from this disease. And high blood pressure seems to be one of the biggest indicators that someone might suffer worse conditions. So that's quite bad. And then we also see other comorbidities such as diabetes, heart disease, heart malfunction, renal insufficiency, and active cancer and other things. Also, we should note that basically only 2% of the people who died who had no other diseases, whereas 21% of people died who have one of these diseases. So this really tells us that we have to take care of our health, and we should be exercising, eating well. There was something else down here. Yeah, most common symptoms. So again, you know, most people want to know what symptoms are of this disease. Most common symptom is fever and dry cough. Those are the two big ones. So if you find someone sneezing next to you, don't be so scared. Sneezing is actually not a symptom. It's not even on here, I don't think. So just remember fever, dry cough, check your fever, check your temperature every day. You'll be able to find out. I really love this chart here. It tells us the difference between COVID-19 and common cold, flu, and allergies. Really, really valuable, especially for me now. I'm suffering from allergies, but you can see that with allergies, you know, you don't get a fever very often with allergies, whereas with COVID-19, it's very common. So you can see the common symptoms are fever, dry cough, shortness of breath, and nothing else has those three things. Although with shortness of breath, you might get that with allergies quite a lot. So just because you have a shortness of breath doesn't necessarily mean that you are getting this disease. You could be suffering from allergies. Also, one more I thought we should add on the side there is anxiety. Recently, I've talked to some people who suffered some anxiety attacks, and a lot of those people, they feel hot, they get red and flushed, and that is not a fever. That's something different. And when you get an anxiety attack, you might feel like your heart is pumping, you might have trouble breathing, and you might feel like you're hot, but that's not usually an actual fever. So if you have those kinds of symptoms, dizziness maybe, you might be having an anxiety attack. So just be aware of that. So that's one of the important sets of data I wanted to show, just to give you an overview of what's actually happening in Japan. I mean, give you an overview of what's actually happening in the world. So let's look at Japan. Now, I really like this site, and we'll look at one column, I guess, at a time here. So this is toyokeizai.net. This is a really good site for looking at Japan-specific trends and specific information. Now, these are the tested positive cases. Now, I know a lot of people complaining about not enough tests in Japan, and that may be the case, but this is the data that we have, and so this is the data we have to look at. So these are the number of tested positive as of March 28th, 12 o'clock. And we can see that the number is gradually increasing. And I have it set on new because this is really what we're most interested in, and whether this number is actually getting higher and higher. And what we would normally see in that curve is that big spiking curve when we see, and I'll show you a better chart of it a little bit later. But that's really what we're looking for here. We want to see if these numbers keep going higher and higher. We do see a little bit of an indication here, and so if these numbers continue to rise at a faster and faster pace, we would say that we were in the spiking in the pandemic curve, right? These are the cases with symptoms, very close to the number of tested positive. Japan does test more people than actually have symptoms. So if they're in contact with someone who has symptoms, then they might be tested. And so these are the total number of tested positive. These are total number who have tested positive with symptoms. And you can see the day-on-day increase here as well. These are the number of discharged patients, and hopefully this will continue to rise. PCR tested, it's sort of weird. I don't know why the graph looks like this. I'm not sure why they have such different number of tests on every day. I really don't understand that, but that is the data that we're looking at. Serious cases, relatively flat. Day-on-day changes is about 4. You can see the total number increasing, but we're not seeing a large number increasing in new cases. And again, deaths, it's going to increase as we move forward, especially in Japan, because we have such an elderly population. This is the same information by age. You can see that number of deaths, again, is higher side, just like we've seen on the other countries. And we can see with miscellaneous and serious conditions also higher side, and no symptoms somewhere in here. Something interesting, I read in an article that says that teenagers are less likely to be symptomatic, but there are some cases of babies, infants having a higher incidence. So this actually fits with the data that I've read. This gives you information by prefecture. And again, this is the number of positive tested cases, confirmed cases, which may not represent the actual number of cases. So this will give you a little bit of overview of Japan's situation. Now, this is a really interesting chart, and this was really what I wanted to focus on today and try to explain a little bit about what's happening in the wider world. So this was put together by a couple of physicists, actually, not epidemiologists. And what they did here is, like, most of the graphs and most of the charts we see show time on the x-axis, and then either new cases or total number of cases on the y-axis. But what they've done here is they put the total confirmed cases on the x-axis and then the new confirmed cases on the y-axis. And what this means is that when we see a kind of logarithmic curve, when we see that curve increasing at a faster and faster rate like we would expect in an epidemic, what we actually see on this chart is a straight line. Now, instead of, because time on this chart, we represent time actually through animation. So we can pull back all the way back to January 28th, and we can run through the animation. You can see China was the first. You can see how it goes up in this line and then eventually drops. Now this drop, this drop here, when China drops down, this is the end of its peak, right? So it's peaked here, and then it drops off here rapidly as the total number of new cases is declining, and the total number of cases is only going up a little bit. Also, you notice on these axes, these are logarithmic curves. That's why this works the way it does. So each number is actually 10 times bigger. So this is 100,000, 10,000, 100,000, and 1 million cases here, right? So as we went through the time, you can see all these different countries popping into the simulation, and you can put any country here that you want. But in particular, we can see Japan. And actually, let me deselect these and just put in China. The US is interesting. Of course, Japan, maybe South Korea. And maybe Singapore. So some of these are really interesting. Singapore, because of this dip right? And Japan, you'll see Japan dip a couple times too, but uh, China has a very clear curve. South Korea had a very clear curve and a drop. You can see, so this is again the total number of confirmed cases, but much less than China. US is on a upward trajectory. You can see it's entering, it's still increasing, right? So every day there are more and more and more cases. It is doubling very quickly. Now, Singapore and Japan are really interesting. So Singapore, you say it dropped right away, but now it's back on that curve, and that's not a good thing, right? So it's actually increasing more and more cases per day. So even though they might have stopped it early on, they ended up right back where everybody is. Japan, likewise, seems to be like it stops and starts. Actually, let me get rid of Singapore just for a second so you can see Japan. Japan is stopping and starting and stopping and starting. Now, maybe this is somewhat of an artifact based on the testing that's going on in Japan, but we can see that this curve is upwardly increasing. It's on that trajectory, but it's sort of stopping and starting. Oh, what happened? Oh, it went back to the beginning. So we'll look at Japan again. See Japan coming in there, jumping up and jumping down, jumping around, but it is back on that curve. So it does look like Japan is going to rejoin this curve based on what we're seeing. And so it may end up being on the curve of, on this flatline slope, which means that we would be back in that logarithmic curve and we're increasing the number of cases every day. Hopefully not. I mean, what we want to see is, again, that drop. And if we can see that drop, then we will see that the epidemic basically over. Although you notice it dropped down with China and then came back up. And that's also not a good thing. So if the new confirmed cases rises, we'll see China end up right back up here and maybe starting that curve again. And that's not a good thing. So we don't want to see that. Anyway, I just wanted to show you some of the data that's out there, basic idea of what's happening around the world and what's happening in Japan. And hopefully that will give you some better idea of where different countries might be and allows you to explore that data on your own. I will link those, all that data down below so you can take a look at that. And I just want to remind everyone to do your best keeping some physical distance between you and other people. Again, it doesn't mean you have to be socially distant. Feel free to contact your friends and relatives and talk to people online, call people. Even though we're going to run classes online at APU and at our university, doesn't mean we're not going to connect. I'm going to try to connect with students, and hopefully the students will connect with each other. So keep connecting with people, even if we have to physically distance ourselves from each other. So be aware of what's going on. Go take a look at those sites on your own, explore the data, and be safe.